let's talk about it. Let's talk about Marcy. So I actually forgot to summarize the plot of Amphibia. So let's do that really quick. Hi, this is Editing Lucy. I realize this is a much better setup, and this is a much better camera, and this is a much better audio. I apologize for the rest of the video you're going to watch. So I want to give a brief introduction to what Amphibia is before I just jump into an analysis of Marcy, because you might be like, what is this? What's happening? Who is Marcy? Frogs? For a brief plot summary, Amphibia follows the spunky main character Anne Boonshroyd and her quest through the Amphibia. The Amphibia is this alternate dimension full of frogs and newts and toads. Most of the storyline follows Anne and the Planters. They're like the main group of frogs and people who are just traveling around the Amphibia and getting up to mischief and learning life lessons along the way. The main lore-based storyline, however, is Anne and her two friends, Sasha Waybright and Marcy Wu. They got trapped in this dimension by opening this chest and music box from a thrift store. Marcy is the character we're analyzing today, and we're analyzing her through the lens that she is a neurodivergent character or a neurodivergent coded character. Marcy is introduced as a character in the second season in the episode Marcy at the Gates. I wanted to give a few disclaimers before this analysis, and first in the acknowledgement of that Marcy Wu is not written to be a character who is neurodivergent or autistic or anything in particular. Matt Braley, the main showrunner, says in an interview that he'd rather have her develop as he wrote her, and he didn't have any of these traits particularly in mind when writing her. As I begin my analysis of Marcy, however, I'm going to be looking at through a literacy criticism from the mid-20th century called The Death of the Author. The Death of the Author basically says that the works of a media are just as valid as the original source material. Or in other words, we're going to be analyzing my headcanons as Marcy is a neurodivergent character as if they were canon. It's still important to keep in mind that these aren't canon traits, but we're just going to analyze them as they are though. This is how the character is presented, and this is how I'm interpreting the presented character. And through that analysis, it's a valid analysis. So, in this video, I'll be considering Marcy's character through the lens that she is a neurodivergent character, and not really through the lens that she's coded to be neurodivergent, and what that means. However, it's still important to note that there's nothing in Matt Braley canon about her being a representation of any one neurodivergent. Another note for this analysis is that I'm not a trained psychologist. I'm not ready to diagnose a cartoon character. That's not me. And that's not what this is. I'm also aware there's a lot of comorbidity, so I will be using the word neurodivergent as an umbrella term for the majority of this video, but I understand a lot of headcanons about this character go into specific realms. But for the purpose of this video and simplicity, we're going to be analyzing her as a neurodivergent coded character with that. And let's get back into the video. Let's talk about really quick, what is hyperfixation? Like, what's going on with that? This is a definition from Embark Behavioral Health. Hyperfixation occurs when someone becomes so fully engaged in something that they can't think of anything else until they finish what they're doing or someone pulls them away from it. Most people commonly hyperfocus on people, places, food, TV shows. Marcy's hyperfixation is important because it's literally like a driving plot of the show. A big part of her character is her struggling to balance her interests and being super into her interests and her puzzles and finding out about the world, and also her friends' lives. Let's talk about Marcy. She gets way into her own games and her interests to knows the people around her most times. And she has a very large interest in fantasy, and the audience is shown the side of her immediately. Like, she face plants to the ground, she gets up, she writes in her journal, she sees Anne, and then she starts info dumping about her favorite game. So, Marcy Wu was first introduced in the show's second season in the episode Marcy at the Gates. A long time coming. Her character was teased throughout like the entire first season. Well, kind of. She was kind of like in the intro. But that's a teaser. That's a teaser. When she's introduced, first she's in a flashback. In flashbacks, she's just shown to be this clumsy, smart character, and then we meet her, and she's just this clumsy, smart character. She's wearing these really cool, like, D&D... creatures in caverns. She has a crossbow on her arm. Cool gal. The point of this episode is not only to introduce Marcy to the show, but also to make the audience feel comfortable with Marcy as a character. Sprig, throughout this episode, plays the part of the audience. He doesn't trust her at first because, to be fair, Anne's last friend played swords with her. They had a sword fight. But by the end of the episode, he's able to realize that he can trust her, and he understands that she's not a threat to him, and the audience understands that she's not a threat to us. I think that Marcy's large interest in fantasy is what leads her to hyperfocus on finding out everything she can about Amphibia, hence why she's constantly writing stuff down, even while walking, or in conversation with other people she's writing stuff down. She sees the Planter family that Anne is with, which is 3 frogs, by the way. 3 frogs. She sees the Planter family and she immediately identifies it as a found family trope, which just shows that she's perceiving her entire reality and time in Amphibia as a fantasy adventure. The audience relates to Marcy a lot. She's such a staple piece of Amphibia because she plays the part of the audience really well. It works. We're shown the audience is Marcy. If you've gotten to this point of the 2nd season of this frog show, you are Marcy. You're interested in this fantasy world just as she's interested in it, and she knows so much about it, and she's willing to share it with the audience, aka any character on screen, when she is also on screen, at every point in time. A lot of her dialogue is focused on just like her interest in the world around her, and we're watching the same show. Our interest is in the world around her. The thing about Marcy is that fixation is one of her greatest strengths. She says it herself in the later episode. She calls it being in the zone, and it's her superpower. She gets super into the zone, she gets super into her own games and fixations, and she's able to solve stuff like puzzles super easily, but it comes at the expense of others. She's super intelligent and she understands so much of the world, but she's often not noticing the people around her. She's not noticing that Anne is struggling, fighting off an ant because she's too focused on writing notes about the ants. Her flaw is the same as her strength. Her strength is her interest, and that becomes her flaw is her interest because she's so interested in them that she forgets about the people that are not the interests. Let's talk about hyperfixation furthermore in Amphibia and how it is represented in the episode The First Temple. So, The First Temple is an episode where Anne and Marcy and the Planter family all go to this temple to try and charge one of the stones of the music box. They need all 3 stones charged in order for the music box to work so they can return home. So, in this episode, Marcy's immediately in the show. She comes down off her bird and she immediately starts analyzing the Planter family's home and talks about the century and the house was built and inspired by. Like, it's clear the girl has done her research extensively, good for her. And in nature, she has to be pulled away from the topic by Anne before she can continue talking about the house's structure and which century the house was built in. Again, with like the pulling away from a topic in order to, she would have kept going about Edwardian structure, and good for her. But they have matters at hand. Anne says it herself. She says,
"When you get this into something, you tend to tune everything else out."
To which Marcy replies,
"It's called being in the zone, Anne. It's pretty much my superpower."
Which is so true. Marcy's characterization of fixation, as I said before, is one of those things that's yes, it's really cool that it's one of her main interests and the driving plot of the show, but it's also one of the driving plots of the show because it's also one of her flaws as a character. And she gets too into these things and starts to not think about the people around her, which we see happen in this episode because the last puzzle of the episode is basically a game of wizard chess. If you've seen Harry Potter, it's just it's like giant chess, and the people are in the chess game, It's called Flipwort in Amphibia, if you were curious. So Marcy is playing the game, and in the game's rules, she ends up winning. She ends up being in checkmate, basically. The problem is with the last puzzle in this temple is that the game cheats. Marcy, for a while, still tries to find a way to win, but eventually has to break out of her competitive and hyper-focused nature to realize that she has been hurting Anne and the planters by not giving up. They've been trapped in these chess pieces, and they're like, they're tired, and Marcy has to pull herself out of her own fixation in order for the episode to continue. So she gives up the game, she forfeits, and is actually rewarded for her humility by the temple in the end. It shows that she's able to pull herself out of fixation, and also shows the rewards for her ability to show humility and able to think of others. I mean, she's not like heartless. She just has a hard time realizing with her interests that other stuff is happening, that things are affecting the world around her, which can be common for neurodivergent people to realize. The way that she's written to have struggles with this is written with a lot of respect to her, which I appreciate. She's not doing this out of like this emptiness in her heart. She's doing this because she has struggles with getting out of that headspace sometimes, and that's fair, and that happens. So let's also talk about the episode The Scavenger Hunt, where the rest of this episode is just her running around with Anne, trying to solve a puzzle sent to her by the king. The point of this episode is to show the contrast between Anne's character and Marcy's character. And the conclusion comes to that is that Anne is really good at making connections with people, but she doesn't feel like she's the most intelligent with stuff like puzzles. However, Marcy is just the opposite. She's really good at figuring out these puzzles and these traits in these games because they're like her big interest. She's not good at she doesn't think that she's good at connections with people. She says it herself.
Yeah, sure, I'm good at solving puzzles and calculating the check, but you're amazing at making connections. Me, I have trouble looking people in the eye sometimes.
Also, I just want to point out the big symptom of eye contact and neurodivergency. A lot of neurodivergent people struggle with making eye contact when they're talking with people. It requires so much thought. A large driving plot of the show is Marcy's focus and interest in the world around her. And we know that as soon as we meet her. The whole thing with True Colors, though, is that these traits are shown to the extreme. Hi, it's editor Lucy again. Everything accumulates for this whole show, goes together, and comes back to Marcy and her hyperfixation on the fantasy world around her. Her interest and hyperfixation in the fantasy world around her, once again, topples over her friends. This being her character flaw and the reason they get trapped there. I'm not necessarily arguing that she's just avoiding consequences. She's hyper-focused on this world. She's having trouble pulling out of it. She's not just trying to avoid her consequences and responsibilities. While that is something that's happening, as we can see with her trying to avoid going back home to deal with her parents moving her away, to deal with her losing the only two friends that she has possibly ever made. So she is avoiding consequences, but my argument is that there's another layer to this, and that layer is her hyper-focus on this world, with no one to pull her out of it. It's hard for her to distinguish between these interests and hurting the people. It's hard to realize, and she doesn't know exactly what to do. She doesn't know exactly who to help her. In earlier parts of the show, when she's focused in on something, she has Anne to pull her away, or Andreas to pull her away, but there's no one to pull her away from this because Andreas is encouraging her, and Sasha, I don't think, understand what to do. The amazing thing about the show is that she's a redeemable character. She's so fleshed out and human, and her traits about her interests and her fixations and her flaws and the mistakes that she made, it just makes her more human to a human audience. She's redeemable because of these traits. She's redeemable because she is the audience. We see ourselves in Marcy. The audience can relate to a character being excited about a fantasy world because the audience is watching a fantasy world unfold. She has no one to pull her away from this world. It's hard for her to do that on her own. As viewers of the show, we find this understandable. We also don't want the same fantasy world to end particularly. coding her characterization to have neurodivergent traits is important for this community because she isn't a villain. Marcy Wu is not the villain of Amphibia, and she isn't framed to be either. Even in True Colors, she's not framed to be the villain. Her flaws make her human. She feels regret, she apologizes, she cries. These are human traits. And this is why Darcy works so well. Darcy is Marcy, but strips away all of her human traits, using her only as a vessel for her intelligence. Even while Darcy makes a joke about having some of Marcy's quirks, she's still stripped of what made Marcy so interesting to the audience. She's stripped of her interest in the fantasy world. We can no longer sympathize with her. Plus, Darcy's like totally evil and working for the main villain. So, like, of course we're not sympathizing with her, but like, still, this is why. Darcy no longer has a special interest in the world, and she doesn't reflect the audience. She's a completely separate character from Marcy, and she's completely foiling Marcy. Darcy is just the intelligence of Marcy and a bunch of other newts of the past. And that foil of being human is what makes her even more redeemable. It what makes the audience sympathize with her more. And even when she's trapped inside the core, even when she's offered a perfect fantasy world, she rejects it. She realizes that it's not real. She realizes she can't live like that. She can't have the perfect Amphibia. She can't have the perfect fantasy. So she rejects it. She accepts reality and rejects the fantasy of Amphibia. She isn't objecting her interests and fixations. She still loves fantasy. And this is wonderful because we see this in the time skip. Hey. So I lost the footage, but time skip Marcy! Woo! In Amphibia, in the series finale, it ends in a 10-year time skip, and Marcy becomes an artist at the end. She is a webcomic, like webtoon artist. It's really cute. I think it's a fantastic way to end her character because she's finding a healthy outlet for her passions and then doesn't get stuck with just being seen for her brains. She doesn't go to college, she's following her interests, she's following fantasy, and this makes the most sense for her character. She's not stuck with just being seen for her brains, but instead she's following what she wants to do. So, with Marcy's character arc wrap up, I would like to compare it to Luz Noceda from The Owl House. Spoilers, if you haven't seen the ending of The Owl House, I'm specifically talking about the ending of the entire series, so spoilers, go watch The Owl House. It's a wonderful show. Except for my professor who has to grade this, I'm spoiling all of this just for you. So, Luz from The Owl House is specifically written to be a neurodivergent character. Yay! She has trouble making friends in Connecticut. She is shown to be eccentric, as quick thinking. Analyzing Luz as a character is similar in her entire arc. She is the main character of her show, so there's a lot more focus on her, and continually through The Owl House, Luz is shown to be constantly doing things her own way to resolve plots and issues in the show. I mean, her main character trait is that she's a human and she can't do magic, but she finds her own way to do magic. She finds her own way to learn because she loves learning, similar to how Marcy loves learning. In The Owl House, the show wraps up with Luz going to college in the Demon Realm and majoring in everything. The ending is wonderful for many reasons. Coming from someone who is neurodivergent, I've kind of felt crushed about school my entire life. A lot of my instructors and teachers don't understand the way that I learn differently, even upon explaining it to them a lot of times, which is very frustrating for everyone involved. I love learning, I love studying, and I love getting everything I can. I see myself in Luz, and I also see myself in Marcy. So I just like both of these endings. Specifically with The Owl House, Luz's arc shows that even though you may learn differently, you can still do extraordinary things. And the theme of the show is a wonderful representation of neurodivergency. In contrast to Luz's character arc, Marcy does not end up going to college. But in similarity, she also loves learning throughout the entire show. And I just think this is also an amazing way to wrap up a character. Marcy is shown to be intelligent the entire series, and she glides her way through school, in contrast to Luz, who struggles with school. However, Marcy ends up being an artist and she creates little webcomics. She learns how to put her focus towards learning and drawing in a healthy way, and she's shown to still be following her passion for fantasy and adventure. This arc for Marcy represents passion in the same way that it represents passion for Luz. They are both characters who love to learn and do so in different ways, and both of these ways are neurodivergent coded, and both of them end up following their greatest passions by the end of the show, in a time skip nonetheless. Whether that means going to college or not. Both of these characters also represent out-of-the-box thinking, and I like both these shows a lot, and I think that they do a lot for neurodivergent representation in a positive light. I think a lot of the time that focus on neurodivergent folks is focused on what they lose by being a neurodivergent person, but I'm not anything more, anything less for the way I am. I am the way I am. And there should be so much more positive media representation of people who are like me. And by casually having a neurodivergent coded character like Marcy in Amphibia and showing her to be fun and eccentric and likable and redeemable and not a villain and not curing her of her hyperfixation, still showing her to be super interested in fantasy as an adult, this is wonderful representation. And I just like the way that the show ends. To end this video, I'd like to pull up a quote said by a scholar by the name of Jillian N. Wright. She says, "So much of the literature on ADHD and autism focuses on our deficits, painting us as disordered, pathologizing our very existence. Yes, neurodiverse people struggle, as do neurotypical people. We may experience more challenges due to our neurology, but in many cases, our challenges stem from a lack of understanding and accommodation in general society." Thank you guys for watching my video on Marcy Wu from Amphibia. I appreciate it a lot. This is my first video essay I've ever written and edited and done everything of the processes, so I don't know if I'll do this again, but I really enjoyed making this. It's been really fun for me. I know there's a lot of blimps in the process, but I appreciate it. I hope you have a good day. Bye! Bye 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 bye!
You